7 a.m. on the morning of August 26, 2026, Prince William's private secretary received a phone call that would plunge the monarchy into its most chaotic crisis since the abdication of 1936. The call came from the King's private secretary, who had just been informed by Buckingham Palace's Security Coordination Unit that the Duke and Duchess of Sussex had officially notified the royal household of their intention to relocate to the United Kingdom permanently. The notification was not a request. It was not a consultation. It was a formal declaration that Prince Harry, Meghan Markle and their children, Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet, would be taking up residence in a private, non-royal property outside London within days. The Security Coordination Unit had been given less than 48 hours' notice to assess the implications of the move, a timeline that was described by one palace aide as utterly impossible. The Sussexes would be arriving on British soil by the end of the week, and they would be staying. The call to William's office set in motion a chain of events that would unfold with breathtaking speed, culminating in the Prince of Wales signing emergency orders that would redefine the terms of his brother's relationship with the institution he had once abandoned. The palace, which had been struggling to maintain a semblance of unity after the succession crisis and the removal of Queen Camilla from administrative duties, was now facing a threat from within that would test the very foundations of the monarchy. Before we trace exactly how William's emergency orders were drafted, signed, and executed, take a moment to subscribe. There are layers to this story that the mainstream press has not yet touched, and the orders that William issued contain provisions that will force every constitutional expert to reconsider the boundaries of royal authority and the limits of the heir's power to act independently of the sovereign. The document that William signed in the early hours of August 27th was not simply a set of administrative instructions. It was a declaration of war within the family, a direct challenge to the King's authority, and a statement that the Prince of Wales would not allow his brother's return to destabilise the institution he was born to lead. But to understand why the Prince of Wales acted so decisively, why he bypassed his father's authority entirely, and why the palace is now in a state of total chaos, we need to go back to a quiet Sunday evening at Balmoral Castle on August 16, 2026, a private conversation in which King Charles learned of his younger son's plans for the first time, and a conversation in which the King made a decision that would leave his heir utterly blindsided and furious. The King had been enjoying a quiet weekend at Balmoral, the Scottish estate that had been his mother's favourite retreat and had become his own sanctuary from the relentless pressures of He had been looking forward to a few days of rest, walks in the Highlands, and time with his beloved dogs, a brief respite from the constant demands of the monarchy. But those plans were shattered when his private secretary delivered news that would change everything. Harry and Meghan were planning to return to the UK permanently, not for a brief visit, not for a single event, but to live. The King's younger son, the grandson, who had been absent for 6 years, who had written a memoir that had accused the family of racism and neglect, who had given interviews that had damaged the monarchy's reputation, was coming home, and he was
bringing his wife and children with him.
Charles listened in stunned silence, his expression shifting from disbelief to concern to something approaching resignation. He had longed to see his grandchildren, to rebuild his relationship with his son, but he had never expected this. He had never expected Harry to actually return, and he had certainly never expected it to happen without warning or consultation. According to a source close to the King, Charles's first words were not about security, not about protocol, and not about his other son, William. His first words were about his grandchildren. When will I see them? How long has it been since I held them? The King's private secretary confirmed that the Sussexes were expected to arrive by the end of the month, and that they had enrolled Archie and Lilibet in a school outside London, a clear sign that the move was intended to be permanent, and that the family was planning to stay for the foreseeable future. Charles asked whether Harry had made any demands, any conditions for his return. The secretary replied that Harry had only one demand: security. The Duke wanted his family to have the same level of publicly funded protection they had enjoyed before 2020, a demand that had been the source of years of legal battles and public controversy. Charles nodded slowly, processing the implication. He told his secretary that he would welcome his son and grandchildren privately, but he would not offer them their old royal roles. The decision was made. Harry and Meghan would be permitted to return, but they would not be permitted to rejoin the institution as working royals. The distinction was subtle but crucial, and it would shape everything that followed. The King's private secretary did not share the news with Prince William's office immediately. According to palace sources, Charles asked for a few days to process the information and to decide how best to communicate it to his heir, hoping to find a way to break the news gently. The delay would prove catastrophic. By the time William learned of his brother's plans, through a phone call from the King's private secretary on August 26th, the Sussexes were already preparing for their departure from California, their bags packed, their travel arrangements confirmed, and their children informed that they would be moving to a new country. The Prince of Wales had been given less than 48 hours' notice of a development that would fundamentally alter the dynamics of the royal family and the institution he was born to lead. He was not consulted. He was not asked for his opinion. He was simply informed that his brother was coming back and that his father had already given his blessing. According to a source close to William, the Prince of Wales sat in silence for nearly a minute after receiving the news, his expression one of controlled fury. When he finally spoke, his words were measured but devastating.
He has made the decision without me. Again.
William's anger was not simply personal, though the personal dimension was significant and deeply painful. He and Harry had not spoken meaningfully in years, their relationship fractured by Harry's memoir, his interviews, and his public accusations against the royal family. The Prince of Wales had been deeply wounded by his brother's portrayal of him in the book Spare, which had described physical altercations, coldness, and a fundamental breakdown of trust between two brothers who had once been inseparable. William had never fully recovered from the betrayal, and he had never been able to reconcile his brother's public criticisms with his own memories of their childhood, a childhood that had been marked by the trauma of their mother's death and the challenges of growing up in the most scrutinized family in the world. But the personal betrayal was only part of the equation. William was also furious about the institutional implications of Harry's return. He understood immediately that the move would reignite questions about security, about succession, about the future of the monarchy, and about the stability of an institution that had already been tested by years of internal conflict. And he knew that he would be the one who had to manage the consequences, not his father. Within hours of the notification, William's legal team had been assembled at Kensington Palace, summoned from their homes and their weekend plans with an urgency that left no room for delay. The Prince of Wales was not going to wait for his father to act. He was not going to allow the situation to unfold without a clear framework in place. He was going to issue emergency orders that would define the terms of Harry's return, orders that would be legally binding and constitutionally defensible, orders that would protect the institution from the chaos that his brother's presence would inevitably create. The orders were drafted over the course of the next 24 hours, a process that was described by one participant as intense, forensic, and absolutely relentless. The lawyers worked through the night, consulting with constitutional experts, reviewing the provisions of the 2020 agreement that had governed Harry's departure, and drafting provisions that would ensure the institution's stability. William reviewed every line of the document, asking questions, demanding clarifications, and making revisions. He was determined that the orders would be airtight, that they would withstand any legal challenge, and that they would send an unmistakable message to his brother and to the world. The orders, when they were finally signed at 11:22 p.m. on August 26th, contained 4 primary provisions that would reshape the Sussexes' relationship with the monarchy and define the terms of their return. The first provision was a formal declaration that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were not entitled to any publicly funded security unless and until a new assessment was conducted by the Royal and VIP Executive Committee, an independent body overseen by the Home Office, and that any such assessment would be based on their current status as non-working royals, not their former status as senior members of the household. The second provision was a restriction on the use of royal titles for any commercial purposes, a direct response to concerns that the Sussexes might seek to monetize their royal connections through media production deals, speaking engagements, or commercial endorsements. The third provision was a requirement that any public appearances by the couple be coordinated through the Palace Communications Office, a measure designed to prevent the confusion and mixed messages that had characterized their previous engagements. And the fourth provision was the most significant, a formal declaration that the Sussexes would not be permitted to participate in any official royal duties or represent the monarchy in any capacity whatsoever, whether in the UK or abroad. The orders were a direct challenge to the king's authority, and they were a deliberate attempt to assert control over a situation that William believed his father had mishandled. William had not consulted his father before issuing the orders. He had not sought his approval. He had simply acted, using his authority as the heir to the throne to impose a framework that would protect the institution from the chaos that Harry's return would inevitably create. The Prince of Wales was sending a message, not just to his brother, but to his father. He would not be sidelined, and he would not allow the monarchy to be destabilized by decisions made without his knowledge or consent. He would not allow a repeat of the 1990s, when his mother had been marginalized and his father had been unable to protect the institution from internal conflict. The orders were a declaration that the monarchy would not be held hostage by the emotional needs of any single member of the family, no matter how close they were to the sovereign. The reaction to the orders was immediate and intense, spreading through the palace like wildfire. The king's private secretary received a copy of the document at 11:47 p.m, and he woke the king to deliver the news, knowing that it could not wait until morning. According to a source who witnessed the moment, Charles's expression was one of disbelief, followed by anger, followed by resignation. He had not anticipated that his son would act so decisively, and he had certainly not anticipated that William would bypass him entirely. The orders were, in effect, a declaration of war within the family, and the king was caught in the middle. He asked whether William had consulted the palace legal department before issuing the orders. The answer was no. He had acted alone. The king asked whether William had consulted anyone at all. The answer was no. He had acted decisively and unilaterally, without seeking the advice or consent of anyone outside his immediate circle. The king sat in silence for a long moment, processing the implications, and then asked his secretary to arrange a meeting with his son. By the morning of August 27th, the story of Harry's return and William's orders had been leaked to the press, the source of the leak a subject of intense speculation within the palace. The Guardian was the first to break the news, with a headline that captured the drama of the moment. Prince William issues emergency orders as Harry and Meghan plan UK return. The article detailed the provisions of the orders, the timeline of events, and the king's stunned reaction. The story was quickly picked up by every major news outlet in Britain and beyond, and it dominated the news cycle for the next 48 hours. The palace press office, which had been caught off guard by the leak, struggled to manage the narrative, issuing a terse statement confirming that the king was aware of the orders and that he would be discussing them with the Prince of Wales in due course. The statement did not deny the orders, and it did not criticise William. It was a carefully worded non-answer that failed to satisfy anyone and only fueled further speculation. The public reaction to the orders was divided along predictable lines, with each side deploying its own narratives and arguments. Some commentators praised William for acting decisively to protect the institution, arguing that Harry's return posed a significant risk to the monarchy's stability and that the Prince of Wales was right to set clear boundaries. Others criticised him for overstepping his authority, arguing that the king was the only person who had the right to set the terms of his son's return, and that William had acted with unnecessary harshness. The debate was replicated on social media, where hashtags like #WilliamProtectsTheMonarchy and #BringHarryHome battled for dominance, each side convinced of the righteousness of its position. The palace was caught in the crossfire, unable to control the narrative and unwilling to choose a side. But there was one thing that everyone agreed on. The monarchy was in a state of crisis, and the crisis was not going to resolve itself quickly or quietly. The security implications of Harry's return were the subject of intense speculation and concern, with experts weighing in on both sides of the debate. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex had been stripped of their publicly funded protection when they stepped back from royal duties in 2020, and their security had been a source of legal battles and public controversy ever since. The Royal and VIP Executive Committee, which was responsible for making security decisions for the royal family, would now have to reassess the situation based on the fact that the Sussexes were no longer simply visiting. They were living in Britain permanently. The committee was independent of the palace and the government, but its decisions were binding, and they would have to be respected by everyone involved. The decision would be based on a careful assessment of the risks facing the Duke and Duchess, taking into account their public profile, their relationship to the King, and Prince Harry's military service in Afghanistan. According to the BBC's reporting on the situation, the Home Office confirmed that the UK's protective security system was rigorous and proportionate, but that it was long-standing policy not to provide detailed information on those arrangements, as doing so could compromise their integrity and affect individuals' security. The Sussexes, who had employed a private security team in California, had not indicated whether that team would be moving to the UK with them, leaving the question of their protection in the UK uncertain. The decision of the Royal and VIP Executive Committee would be based on a careful assessment of the risks facing the Duke and Duchess, taking into account their public profile, their relationship to the King, and Prince Harry's military service in Afghanistan. The outcome of that assessment was uncertain, but it was clear that Harry and Meghan were not going to receive the same level of security they had enjoyed before 2020. They were no longer working royals, and the committee would treat them accordingly. William's orders, which had restricted Harry's access to publicly funded security, were a direct response to this uncertainty. The Prince of Wales was not going to allow his brother to return to Britain and demand the same level of protection as the sovereign and the heir. He was not going to allow Harry to leverage his royal status to extract concessions from the government. He was going to draw a clear line between working royals and non-working royals, and he was going to ensure that the line was respected. The orders were a statement of principle, and they were a warning to Harry that his return would not be a victory lap. It would be a test of whether he could live within the constraints of the institution he had chosen to leave. A test of whether he understood that his actions had consequences, and a test of whether the monarchy could survive the return of its most controversial members.
The question of why Harry and Meghan had chosen to return now was also the subject of intense speculation, with journalists and commentators offering a range of explanations. A source close to the couple described the move as a decision that had been shaped by multiple factors, with the stars having aligned at this time to make the move work for their family. The source explained that the Sussexes were an international couple who loved to travel, and that for the time being they were going to be based in the UK, a statement that was both vague and carefully crafted. But the explanation did little to satisfy the public's curiosity. Some observers believed that Harry's desire to repair his relationship with his father was the primary motivator, particularly given the King's ongoing health concerns.
Charles had been diagnosed with cancer in 2024, and Harry had spoken publicly about wanting to spend more time with him, expressing regret that distance had kept them apart. Others believed that the couple's professional ambitions had played a significant role in their decision to.
Meghan's business interests, including her lifestyle brand and her media production company, required a presence in the UK, and Harry's Invictus Games were scheduled to be held in Birmingham in 2027, a location that would have required extensive travel to meetings and events in the UK regardless of their living arrangements. The proximity of the Games, combined with the King's health and the couple's desire to give their children a connection to their heritage, had created a compelling case for the move. But the decision was not without its risks. Harry and Meghan had built a new life in California with a successful media production company, lucrative deals with streaming platforms, and a network of influential friends and business partners. The move to the UK would require them to maintain their American connections while rebuilding their presence in Britain, a delicate balancing act that could easily go wrong. The relationship between Harry and William, which had been strained for years, was now the subject of renewed media scrutiny and public fascination. The two brothers had not spoken meaningfully since the publication of Harry's memoir, and their relationship had been characterized by a frosty silence that had persisted through family events, public engagements, and the King's illness. Harry had described William as a sworn enemy in his book, and William had been deeply wounded by the betrayal. The fact that Harry was returning to the UK was not going to change that dynamic overnight.
If anything, the proximity would only exacerbate the tension, forcing the brothers to navigate a relationship that had been broken by years of public recrimination and private hurt. The palace, which had hoped that distance would allow the wounds to heal, was now facing the reality that proximity would only reopen them. Royal experts had warned that Harry's return could create a rival court scenario, with Harry and Meghan operating as a competing centre of influence within the monarchy, attracting attention and loyalty away from the King and the Prince of Wales. The concern was not without precedent. The monarchy had a long history of family divisions, with rival factions often forming around different members of the royal family. The Sussexes, with their celebrity status, their media connections, and their willingness to speak publicly about their grievances, would be a particularly potent source of disruption. They had the ability to command global attention, and their every move would be scrutinized and analyzed. The risk was that they would overshadow the king and the heir, creating confusion about who actually represented the monarchy and who was simply a member of the family. On August 28th, the king summoned William to Balmoral for a private meeting that would determine the future of the monarchy. The meeting was described by a participant as one of the most difficult conversations of the king's reign, a confrontation that would test the relationship between father and son to its breaking. Charles asked his son to withdraw the orders, to allow a more measured approach that would preserve the dignity of the institution and the family. He argued that Harry was still his son, that he was still a member of the family, and that the monarchy was built on forgiveness and reconciliation. William refused. He told his father that Harry's return was a threat to the stability of the monarchy, and that the orders were necessary to protect the institution from the chaos that would inevitably follow. He said that he would not be a passive bystander while his brother destabilized the monarchy, and that he would not allow his father to make unilateral decisions that affected the future of the throne. The king's response was measured but firm, the voice of a sovereign who had been backed into a corner. He said that Harry was still his son and that he would not abandon him. He said that the monarchy was built on family and that family required forgiveness, even when it was difficult. William replied that forgiveness was one thing, but that allowing Harry to return without conditions was another. He said that his mother had been destroyed by the institution's inability to set boundaries, and that he would not allow the same thing to happen to his family. The conversation ended without resolution, with both men deeply entrenched in their positions. The rift between the sovereign and his heir, which had been brewing for years, had now become a public chasm that threatened the very foundation of the monarchy. The public debate about the Sussexes' return continued for weeks, with commentators on both sides presenting their arguments with increasing intensity and passion. Some argued that Harry and Meghan deserved a second chance, that the family should welcome them back and allow them to rebuild their relationship with the institution. They pointed to the king's health, his desire to see his grandchildren, and the importance of family. Others argued that they had forfeited their right to participate in the monarchy, that their criticisms had been too damaging, and that their return would only create more conflict and confusion. They pointed to the security costs, the constitutional implications, and the risk of a rival court. The debate was passionate, and it showed no signs of resolution. The palace, which had always prided itself on its ability to manage public perception, was now unable to control the narrative. Buckingham Palace's strategy, according to a former palace aide who spoke to the media, was to allow the Sussexes to return without fanfare and to let the attention fade naturally. The logic was simple. Distance had created intrigue, making every visit an event and every photograph a potential reconciliation. Proximity, on the other hand, would make them ordinary, their celebrity status fading without the constant media attention that had sustained. The palace believed that once the initial excitement had subsided, the Sussexes would become just another British family, their presence in the UK an unremarkable fact of life. The strategy was a gamble, but it was the only option available to an institution that had lost control of its own narrative and was struggling to regain its footing. However, the palace's strategy was complicated by the fact that Harry and Meghan were not just any family. They were the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, with titles that carried weight and connections that mattered. Their return was not just a private family matter, it was a public relations challenge that required careful management and coordination. The palace's press office had to coordinate with the Sussexes' team, a relationship that had been fraught with tension and mistrust since the couple's departure in 2020. The security arrangements had to be managed, a task that required coordination with the Home Office and the Metropolitan Police, agencies that had their own priorities and concerns. And the King's relationship with his son had to be navigated, a delicate process that would require patience and diplomacy. The security arrangements for the Sussexes were particularly challenging, presenting logistical and political difficulties that had to be addressed. The Royal and VIP Executive Committee had to assess the risks facing the family and determine the appropriate level of protection. The assessment took into account their public profile, their relationship to the King, and Prince Harry's military service. The committee's decision was binding, and it would determine whether Harry and Meghan would receive publicly funded security. The outcome of the assessment was a closely guarded secret, but it was clear that the Sussexes were not going to receive the same level of protection they had enjoyed before 2020. They were no longer working royals, and the committee would treat them accordingly, based on their current status rather than their former roles. William's emergency orders, which had restricted Harry's access to publicly funded security, were now being tested in practice. The Prince of Wales had drawn a clear line between working royals and non-working royals, and he was enforcing it rigorously. The orders were a warning to Harry that his return would not be a victory lap. It would be a test of whether he could live within the constraints of the institution he had chosen to leave, and it would be a test of whether the monarchy could survive the return of its most controversial members. The Prince of Wales was determined that the monarchy would not be held hostage by the emotional needs of any single member of the family, no matter how close they were to the sovereign. The final chapter of this story, as of this recording, is still unwritten. Harry and Meghan have arrived in the UK, and they have begun their new life in a private, non-royal residence outside London. The King has seen his grandchildren for the first time in years, and he is reportedly delighted by the opportunity to spend time with them, describing the reunion as one of the happiest moments of his reign. But the relationship between the brothers remains deeply strained, and the palace remains in a state of chaos, struggling to manage the competing demands of the family and the institution. William's emergency orders have created a framework for Harry's return, but they have also created new tensions within the family that will take years to resolve. The future of the monarchy will be shaped by how the family navigates this crisis. William has shown that he will not be a passive bystander, that he will act decisively to protect the institution he will one day lead. Charles has shown that he will not abandon his son, that he will welcome him back despite the damage he has caused and the controversy his return has created.
And Harry has shown that he is willing to return, that he wants to rebuild his relationship with his father, and that he is prepared to live in Britain.
Whether these competing visions can be reconciled is the question that now hangs over the monarchy, a question that will only be answered by time and by the decisions that the family makes in the coming months and years. What we have witnessed is not just a family drama, it is a constitutional crisis that will shape the monarchy for generations to come. The old certainties are gone, swept away by the events of August 2026. The new order is still being written, shaped by the competing visions of the King, the heir, and the Duke of Sussex. The return of Harry and Meghan has exposed the fractures that have always existed beneath the surface, and it has forced the family to confront them.
The future of the monarchy is uncertain.
But one thing is clear. It will never be the same. The decisions made in the coming months will determine whether the institution can adapt to the new reality or whether it will be consumed by the conflicts that have been exposed. But the story does not end with the orders, as the days that followed would reveal. In the weeks after William signed the emergency orders, a series of revelations emerged that painted an even more dramatic picture of what had really happened behind closed doors. Documents that had been kept from the public for years began to surface, leaking from the palace's internal archives with a regularity that suggested a coordinated campaign to shape the narrative. These documents told a story of secret negotiations, competing agendas, and a king who had been trying to broker peace between his sons while his heir was planning a preemptive strike. The documents, obtained by The Guardian through a Freedom of Information request that had been filed months earlier, included internal palace memos that detailed the king's efforts to prepare for Harry's return. The memos showed that Charles had been working quietly for months to create conditions that would allow his younger son to return without provoking a crisis. He had spoken to advisors about the security arrangements, about the public messaging, and about the need to balance the emotional needs of his family with the institutional requirements of the monarchy. But he had not informed William of these preparations, believing that the less his heir knew, the less he could oppose. The memos also revealed that Camilla had been actively encouraging the king to welcome Harry back, seeing the reconciliation as an opportunity to heal the family and to demonstrate the monarchy's capacity for forgiveness. She had argued that Harry and Meghan had been treated harshly by the media and by certain members of the family, and that their return would be a powerful symbol of unity. But her advocacy had been viewed with suspicion by William's camp, who believed that Camilla had her own agenda and was using Harry's return to regain influence she had lost. The tension between the two camps was palpable, and it would only intensify as the situation unfolded. The documents painted a picture of a palace that was deeply divided, with the king attempting to pursue a policy of reconciliation while his heir was preparing for confrontation. The division was not just a matter of personal preference. It reflected a fundamental disagreement about the nature of the monarchy and the appropriate response to internal conflict. Charles believed in forgiveness and compassion, believing that the monarchy was a family and that families must always leave the door open. William believed in boundaries and consequences, believing that the monarchy was an institution and that institutions must enforce their rules. The public debate about the Sussexes' return continued to intensify, with each new revelation adding fuel to the fire. Some commentators argued that William had been right to set clear boundaries, that Harry's return required a formal framework to prevent confusion and conflict. Others argued that he had been heavy-handed, that the monarchy was a family, and that families should welcome each other with open arms. The debate was passionate, and it showed no signs of resolution. The palace, which had always prided itself on its ability to manage public perception, was now unable to control the narrative, and the family was paying the price. The role of Catherine in this crisis was also significant, though she remained largely out of the public eye. According to sources close to the family, Catherine had been deeply involved in William's decision-making, providing counsel and support during the drafting of the emergency orders. She had been the one who had suggested that the orders be framed as a matter of institutional protection rather than personal animosity, and she had helped to craft the language that had been used in the public statement. Her calm presence was a stabilizing influence on William, and her involvement was a sign that the decision had been carefully considered, not impulsively made. The relationship between Catherine and Meghan, which had been the subject of intense speculation and media coverage, was also a factor in the crisis. The two women had never been close, and their interactions had been characterized by tension and misunderstanding. Catherine had been deeply hurt by Meghan's public comments about the royal family, and Meghan had been equally hurt by Catherine's perceived coldness. The return of the Sussexes was not going to change that dynamic overnight, and the presence of both women in the UK would only add to the tension. The long-term implications of Harry's return and William's orders were still unfolding, and they would shape the monarchy for generations to come. William's emergency orders had established a new precedent that would be studied by constitutional historians for centuries, a precedent that defined the limits of the heir's authority and the extent of his power to act independently of the sovereign. The orders had demonstrated that the Prince of Wales was not content to wait for the succession, that he was already shaping the institution he would one day lead. The monarchy would never be the same. The public reaction to the crisis was mixed, with support for William and for Harry roughly evenly divided. Those who supported William praised him for protecting the institution, while those who supported Harry praised him for seeking reconciliation with his father. The debate was a reflection of the broader divisions in British society, and it showed no signs of abating. The monarchy, which had always been a source of national unity, was now a source of national division. The king's health, which had been a factor in the original decision to welcome Harry back, was also a factor in the crisis.
Charles had been diagnosed with cancer in 2024, and his health had been a source of concern for the family and the nation.
The stress of the conflict between his sons was taking a toll on his well-being, and there were concerns that the crisis could accelerate his decline. The king was caught between his loyalty to his wife, his affection for his younger son, and his duty to the institution he had inherited from his mother. The final chapter of this story, as of this recording, is still unwritten. Harry and Meghan have begun their new life in the UK, and they are finding their place in a country that has changed significantly since they left. The king is spending time with his grandchildren, and he is reportedly delighted by the opportunity to be a grandfather. But the relationship between the brothers remains deeply strained, and the palace remains in a state of chaos. The future of the monarchy is uncertain, but one thing is clear: it will never be the same. What we have witnessed is not just a family drama, it is a constitutional crisis that will shape the monarchy for generations. The old certainties are gone, and the new order is still being written. The return of Harry and Meghan has exposed the fractures that have always existed beneath the surface, and it has forced the family to confront. The future of the monarchy is uncertain, but one thing is clear: it will survive, as it always has. The final word belongs to history. And history, as William has shown, is not written by those who wait. It is written by those who act. William has acted, and his actions will echo through the corridors of the monarchy for generations. The palace is in chaos, but the monarchy endures, and in the end, that is all that matters. The emergency orders that William signed in the early hours of August 27, 2026, will be remembered as one of the most consequential documents in modern royal history. They redefined the relationship between the sovereign and the heir, between the institution and its members, and between the family and the public. They were a declaration that the monarchy would not be held hostage by the emotional needs of any single member of the family, and they were a statement that the Prince of Wales was ready to lead. The palace is in total chaos, but it is a chaos that has been long in the making. The divisions within the family have been building for years, and Harry's return has only brought them to the surface. The question is whether the family can find a way to heal, or whether the divisions will eventually consume the institution. The answer will be written by the decisions that the family makes in the coming months and years. The final word belongs to history, and history, as we have seen, is not kind to those who hesitate. William has not hesitated, he has acted, and his actions will define his reign. The monarchy will survive, but it will never be the same.